the Feldenkrais artificial floor lesson.
Okay, let's.
Um, to make it short, like the context, I'd like to know about a lesson that was really efficient with one of my clients. And I still wonder why it was so efficient. So, for a bit of
Okay.
context, this man is in his 60s. He had a stroke about 7 years ago with hemiplegia. He recovered quite nicely with the hands, partly because he's fond of model trains. So the occupational therapists, they jumped on the opportunity and he started playing with his hands again. But he was still, I mean, he's still in a wheelchair because he doesn't trust his leg and he couldn't feel his foot. And so that was something that was bothering him. And he called me. The main motivation is that he started having very painful contractions in his leg,
Okay.
especially at night, with the sensation that there were needles going through his leg. So obviously not something that you would like every night. So it was disturbing his sleep, and obviously it was painful. So
Okay.
that was the motivation. And after a few sessions, the pain was eased quite a bit. But there was no significant progress on the, I would say, on the standing front, on the ability to move his feet and the ability to trust his leg. Before, there were two lessons which had really big impact, and one was simply I had him lying supine and taking one toe after the other and pulling gently to seek connection. And the other one was the artificial floor. And after the artificial floor lesson, he started texting everyone in his family because some kind of a miracle happened. He started being able to move his toes again, which was unavailable for years.
Okay.
And quite quickly, he started sensing his foot. Uh, so it was like very, a very important progress for him. And
Mhm.
then when he stood, he could feel some trust in his leg. So that was the beginning of
Tho-
of a
Those were
proper
your
work
words or
towards
his words?
standing.
Sorry.
No, they're his words.
Okay.
He says like, "Oh, now I feel I can trust my leg more." Before that, it was very um, he didn't feel safe because his knee could bend any moment. So that was something that was preventing him from even trying to, to stand because he never knew when the leg would just like vanish. I mean, the
Okay.
support. Um, so my question, the first question is, what would make this lesson so efficient?
Effective.
Effective, yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds like you should have asked him that question. Did
Uh-huh.
you? Did you?
Well, I asked him some questions, but
Okay.
there is, let's say, some he's just talking about the sensations that came back, that the ability that came back. It felt a bit like magic,
Okay.
and to me as well, because I know I like this lesson, like the artificial floor. But to me, it's a bit strange that, for instance, in my training, there was just like maybe one day about this one lesson, and that was done. Whereas when we play with this, people are very impressed with the effects. So my question would be more like, are there some FIs or some one-on-one sessions which would be much more effective, and we could notice why, that there are some elements in the lessons which make it obviously good. Mhm.
Okay. Well, that's a platter of questions,
Yes.
you know?
So it's like just like when
Um,
you have several cards, you can choose one.
And then will you find it? Do I have to tell you which card I chose?
I know you were a magician, so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, well, yeah, but where we start is going to determine,
Mhm,
something about where we go. So, because you're asking, well, let me make sure I understand. So the first question is kind of like, what about this lesson is so particularly effective?
mhm.
And then you're asking a different question, which is what makes lessons effective?
So we have two
So,
layers.
yeah, both of those we could talk about, right?
Mhm. I'd be interested.
Yeah, yeah, might be
Of
interesting.
course.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a little overwhelmed by the questions. But well, because it's a lot to talk about. So let's start with the first question, okay?
Mhm,
You know what? I think what you're asking me is what makes this lesson where the teacher is using, I don't have a board here, but you're using um, this small, hard, rigid thing, and you're touching the floor or the foot of the student as if this is the floor.
yes.
And I mean, people have different ideas about this lesson. When I think about it, let's say in its purest form,
Mhm,
the compositional constraint of the lesson for the teacher is that you only touch the person through the board.
mhm,
Not it's not the basis of your entire relationship, but it is the kind of driving creative force of the lesson, right? Yeah, I mean, by limiting the teacher to that, it gets rid of a lot of other things. So you have to figure out what to do through the means of the board. Um, so I mean that in itself is just so people understand if they don't know the lesson, what we're talking about. Um, and that's different than every other lesson. And I'm I'm saying in its purest form because different people, of course, have different ideas about the rules of the lesson. So I think we could hone your question a little more. How is it that without directly touching the person, right, only
mhm,
through the means of this intermediary? I mean, why would that have any effect? Could be the question to begin with, right? Like,
mhm.
what are we talking about? Um,
And at the same time, I noticed that in this lesson, I mean, the dialogue is very rich between the board and the foot. So quite often we would, let's say, change the angle and wait for the toe to hunt for the board, etc. So indeed, like the practitioner is kind of constrained to using just this, and at the same time, it seems to me that the dialogue is also very deep or rich.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, but perhaps because the channel is so narrow,
Mhm.
right? The communication channel is so narrow, you are finely tuned in
Yeah.
to the person's response,
Mhm.
right? And the repertoire is also it's limited, right? So you can only do so many things in that playground.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So, anyways, I'm trying to say a few things, just not assuming that everybody knows what we're
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah.
Um, and over the course of the lesson, I mean, the way the lesson unfolds is first the response is between the shape of the student's foot and the contact that they make with the board. And at first the conversation is about that the using different surfaces of the board against the foot in different ways. Um, but the conversation is local. It's about the way the foot makes contact.
Hmm. Hmm.
And as the lesson progresses, you begin to, I mean, explicitly explore what happens in the ankle and then through the leg, in the hip, and in the person's pelvis and their lower trunk, lower torso, and through their spine, you're reaching further and further,
Yeah.
right? So the I think one of the things that makes a lesson effective is that there's a structure there that the student follows. They're involved and invested in the story that's
Yeah.
unfolding, and
Yeah.
it's clear to them,
Yeah. Hmm.
so that might be part of the answer in general. The How is this lesson more effective?
Hmm.
The way it engages the person is that there's a story that's being told and they're following along with it. They're engaged in it. It has a kind of clear progression and it makes sense. So I mean, I think that's kind of a general statement of the
Hmm.
way the students engage. I'm not saying that that's the only, I mean, I think that I've had the experience that that lesson works quite well, even if the person falls asleep.
Hmm.
So I'm not saying that's necessary, but I do think that that's part of what makes it effective.
Hmm.
I also think that the things that we address in a lesson are significant to how someone regulates and coordinates their movement. So when we think about our movement, we think about the intention, I want to do something, and the action that happens. But that
Hmm.
relies, being able to turn our intention into action relies on all of these um, unconscious mechanisms that allow, I mean, I'm talking and gesticulating and looking at you, um, but I'm not falling over,
Hmm.
right? But as I move my arms around, my base of support is the same, but my weight is changing and I have to compensate for that. I'm on a chair that moves, so I mean there's even more movement amplified there, but I'm not falling over. But I'm not thinking, oh, I better not fall over because that would be embarrassing.
Hmm.
So I think what's interesting about lessons is how it addresses um, the sensory aspects of those like what our noticing about ourselves has to do with how those unconscious mechanisms work. So when it comes to the foot, if you think about it, we have a fairly small platform for balancing this large articulated architecture, dynamic architecture. Part of how our nervous system controls, regulates our movement without us having to think about standing without falling over is that I think it privileges the sensations from our foot and particularly from our ankles as well. That
Hmm.
the sensation there, right? Because if we're going to control this structure, and by control I mean regulate and navigate, right? Because it's not consciously being controlled. It is. unconsciously being controlled all the time, the input from that area really matters. So the person that you're talking about had a stroke,
Mm.
and their movement is it's interfered with. And I think if we take the kind of this basic notion about the nervous system, the sensory motor loop, then I think we can say that, and if you, I'm in my experience, talking to people who have had strokes, they're the way they know themselves, their sensory experience, their self-perception is kind of messed up,
Mhm.
right? It's not clear to them. Our job as Feldenkrais teachers, our job is to um, help people make sense out of what they're sensing.
Mhm.
So, in other words, the stroke did not affect the sensors um, in the skin, in the muscle, in the connective tissue, and in the joints of the toes, the foot, the ankle, the lower leg, blah, blah, blah. All of that is still operating and fine. And all of those um, signals are reaching the brain. What is problematic is that the person's ability to understand that has is disturbed or undermined.
When you say understand, what do you mean when you say understand? Probably
I
some
mean,
people
to
would
make
think that there
sense
is
of
some,
those sensations,
yeah,
to be
makes
able to
sense.
tell this is my, excuse me. Um, so there,
Like, this is my food.
well, but even this is the outside of my foot,
Yes. Mm.
right? This is pressure on my heel. This is my foot contacting the floor. The way our nervous system is designed is that each of those sensations is reported by a specific sensor,
Mhm.
right? So there are thousands, really millions of messages arriving from the edges, from the periphery of the nervous system to the I I I I was we would say central processing unit if we're talking about a computer. I don't think brains are computers, but you know,
Mm.
it's arriving to central command. All the sentinels are reporting. And the ability to decode that, to make it understandable and actionable, to be able to answer like, well, so what? I think that's what's undermined.
Mhm.
So I would say that the lesson is what it affects is how the person organizes, decodes, makes some order out of all of those sensations, and understands the consequences of them.
Mhm.
And it isn't just individual pieces of information, right? It, it is the collective sensation of them, of those indicators, of those bits, if you want, into some kind of meaningful, ever more meaningful relationships. So I think
Mm.
that's part of it. I think part of it, what happens is all these small movements of the toes and the foot affect the ankle.
Mhm.
And just like we talk about the importance of the optic writing reflexes, the tonic neck reflexes on the global tonus of the body, right? The overall contraction, the underlying contraction, and the distribution of that contraction when you're at rest. I think the same thing happens from below. It begins to have these sea changes, right? That something happens in the foot, and you can see and you can feel in the way the foot is contacting, the way the pressure that you're introducing through the foot into the leg and the rest of the person, their response changes, right? And the only thing that can account for that is a change in the muscle contraction or the resting contraction of the muscle, I think that's part of why it's so effective, right? And then, you said, you asked me a question a few moments ago about what does understand mean? Well, I think this is what is understanding,
That's nice.
right? Our feet are underneath our ability to stand. And
Mhm.
so you are reestablishing not just the sensations, but the connections between those sensations.
And you say that there is something also that I find very interesting, the connection between the sensation and the ability to act. Because in this lesson, what was quite impressive is that like really like this, he got sensations that had at least consciously vanished for years. And so at the same time, he got some sensation back and he got some possibility to contract his toes back.
In his experience, the sensations weren't there, but there is nothing wrong with his peripheral nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
In other
Yeah.
words, the sensations were the messages were being delayed. It's like the letters were being developed, the letters were arriving at his house, but he never opened the envelopes.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Something like that. Right. So it's not like the in the functioning of the nervous system, the sensations were there, even though they weren't available to your student. But all the sensations and the making sense of those sensations is what happens in development,
Mm-hmm.
right? In our infantile development of coordination. And I think that that's what got scrambled or lost or was missing. It's not that the sensations weren't there, it's just they weren't accessible in a way that was useful,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one of the sensations, the overall sensation, is the feeling that your leg is solid, because there is this place isn't right. There is this range, it's pretty narrow, of configuration of the angle of the foot with the lower leg, the angle of the upper leg and the with the lower leg, and the angle of the upper leg with the pelvis, that there is this place where things stack up. It takes very little work. And and I think our system is finely attuned to that sensation. I think that was missing from the, I don't know, sensory vocabulary. It's not vocabulary, it's more like grammar or that's not even the right word. But it's a way, and it's not about the individual building blocks. It's about how you put them together. And when something fits, I mean, we're finely tuned to that. And I don't think your student knew what that was anymore. And this lesson recreates that sensation
Mm-hmm.
of solidity. And once you have that, you know it. And once you know it, you can look for it. But it's like he lost the sense of, it's not that his leg wasn't trustworthy, it's that he didn't know what to look for in order to make it feel like it was trustworthy.
Yeah.
Our work is about making action possible, about making skillful action, developing ability. But that ability is built on the capacity of knowing what to sense for, what sensations to monitor, and how they orient or guide us in knowing when we're on the right track. And so it's like in a way, he lost that constellation of configuration of sensations not because the sensations weren't there, but because they didn't coalesce in a way that made sense. And
Hmm.
this lesson is kind of a apprenticeship, a tutelage in that coalescing.
Okay. Hmm.
That's, I mean, that's how I think about it. If you think about it kind of as a teacher,
Hmm.
the lesson plan is about something, you know, about sensations making sense in a more global sense. Like in a way, it's you could all those sensations are like Christmas ornaments in boxes. Until you have a tree to hang them on, they don't make sense. But once you have that tree, you can begin to notice the patterns that the lights are in and blah blah blah. But it creates something. And I think in a way the lesson provides that kind of scaffolding for
Hmm.
organizing the individual sensations. And and it's significant,
Hmm.
right? I mean, to our capacity to stand. It because those processes are unconscious, the processes of coalescing and then acting upon that is out of our awareness. We don't understand or appreciate the importance of how they come together,
Hmm.
how we're able to put them together, how these gestalts assemble out of the components. And so I think the lesson is not just giving the person the individual sensations that are critical for the skill, the ability we're talking about, standing, walking, moving your foot. The lesson is all of those are coming together in a story that is significant for the capacity that we're talking about. Like in order to be able to stand and to walk, these are the kinds of sensations, not individually, but the the overall configuration or assemblages of those and the connections between the pieces, the areas, and the big picture, if you will. Um, that's what's necessary.
Hmm.
Like if you don't feel that, then it's difficult to have feedback. I mean, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah. There is also like so you described about I mean the thing, how can I say, the connection, like the theme of the connection is very important. And also during the lesson there is something which is striking to me. It's when you play with the toes,
Uh-huh.
for a while it feels as if they had their own personalities, the toes.
Mhm.
And in the beginning it's like, yeah, whatever, kind of teenage attitude, like I'm not interested. And then when you start, I mean, there are some moments when they start being interested. So it seems to me
Interested.
also interested,
Interested or interesting?
interested.
Yeah, yeah.
So it feels like the system itself is also kind of getting more rich. There are some places which are somehow passive, not interested, not engaged in anything. And then
Okay.
you tell them, okay, you could be part of standing, you could be part of the story.
Okay.
And it makes it, I would say, more interesting. I mean, the story is more interesting, and probably the other parts as well are more interested because there are more characters. Is this something that you play with in when you give a lesson? You were telling about the story, so you could play with the idea that maybe some elements, you could play with, let's say, two or three elements, or sometimes you would get some tiny bits that go into like a larger story, like I don't know, like battle scene in a movie.
Like what? I'm sorry.
A battle.
Oh, battle scene. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think that that is special to this lesson,
Yeah.
right? So, Feldenkrais described a hands-on lesson, a functional integration lesson, as a conversation between two people or as a dance.
Yeah.
And I think what that means is, I mean, if we're dancing and I'm leading someone, I mean, if they're unconscious, I'm dragging them around. That's not really a dance, right? They're responding to the guidance or the hints or indications that I'm giving, and I'm responding to their response. And that creates this feedback loop, this complicated relationship there. In a lesson, I am dancing in a way with the person's unconscious,
Hmm.
not with their conscious mind. In other words, in every lesson, I am gauging what's happening with someone, with their tonus, with how they respond to how I press, how that pressure moves through their structure. And I'm changing my behavior according to that response. And then they're responding to that. And their response to that, the person experiences that as something that is happening in them. Some people experience it as something that I'm doing, and most people experience it as, um, I let go.
Hmm.
Well, you know, who's the I who's noticing that, and who's the I who let go? I mean, it's you know, they're this kind of naive thing that I am in control of what's happening and I know what's happening in myself. It, it's not congruent with what's happening in that moment,
Hmm.
right?
And speaking of which, this reminds me of former conversation about the difference between a living organism and a thing. I think you quoted Bateson. Could you,
I was, yeah.
yeah, could
So
you?
I mean, Bateson makes this distinction in where he talks about the thing world and the living world. And in the thing world, what if you want to explain something that happens, if we're talking about cause and effect, the or if we're talking about causality, we're talking about cause and effect. What happened now is based on what happened in the past.
Mm,
I don't know, if I went over and pushed the skeleton and it fell, then it would have fallen because of what I did,
mhm,
right? If I come up to my neighbor's dog and I tap Penny with my foot, she might run away. She might jump on me. She might start to play. She's lying down. Maybe she'd roll over and go back to sleep. I don't know, right? My behavior did not determine the per
mhm,
the, the dog's response, right? Because the dog has its own coordination happening, right? Just
mhm,
movement
mhm,
wise and motivation and all of those things. Yeah, so I don't think of a lesson as, manipulating someone else's skeleton or muscles so that they do something. I that would be a thing world interaction.
yeah,
In the living world, there's a conversation and there's this back and forth and this
mhm,
play. And when I talk to psychologists or psychiatrists, therapists, counselors, whatever, about what we do, um, I say that I deal with the physical manifestations of the unconscious, right? Because I think that's what a habit is. All these things that we've learned that we rely upon that we're not aware of in the moment. But maybe in this conversation, I could say we're dealing with the physical manifesting of the unconscious,
mhm,
right? The unconscious isn't a thing, it's not a state, it's not something that happened. It's an ongoing living process that is in the moment. I mean, in Feldenkrais, we talk about self-image, right? And that could be the conscious, what we're aware of about ourselves, but that is dependent on all of these subterranean or out of our awareness, out of our focus of our awareness, and even out of our ability to be aware of the mechanisms under the
Yeah.
mechanisms that
Yeah.
make it possible for me to have an intention. I think I want to go get something to drink, and to get up and do it without having to think about, well, now I have to shift my weight onto my left foot and blah, blah, blah. All that happens automatically. I think we're addressing all that which is happening automatically.
Mhm, mhm.
Okay.
And
And I
also,
think,
actually, your own. I mean, you're accessing something which is unconscious to the student, and part of this is also unconscious. I mean, when you're touching someone, like some things are conscious and some things are not in your own body as a practitioner. So
yeah,
this,
so where you put your attention matters a lot. And also like that's where how I am being in the moment with the student makes such a big difference.
yeah.
So if I take the board and I'm holding it like this and I push you like that, I, I think at that moment the person is going to feel my effort,
Mm,
behind the board that will be present, or my discomfort. So the person's going to feel my effort or my discomfort. And that's going to, I mean, part of being a good functional integrator is touching someone in a way that they feel themselves and not me,
mm,
right? I want to be, I mean, I can't be totally invisible because that's a myth, right? Um, but I don't want my presence to detract from or take away what their experience is, right?
mm,
And I think we'll go back to the metaphor of a magician, right? I mean, if I am going to take something and make something disappear, right? I have to be focused on what I'm doing, not looking over my shoulder. Because where my attention goes, and it's going to direct yours as well,
mm.
right? And so in in the lesson, the story I'm telling has to do with where I'm taking someone's attention and how I am telling a story. Because once you tell a story, the person begins to follow along, right? The things that happened in the past coalesce. And another thing about this lesson, which I never really have thought about before, is because the playground for contact is so small and the repertoire of movements is so small, you repeat things,
Uh-huh.
right? And it's not exact, it's repetition without repetition. Um, but but you do come back to things, and when you come back to them, they mean something different than what they did at first.
Mm,
Just like in a story, when you learn the background of what happened, the next time a certain event comes up, it has a different meaning because you have a different understanding and a different
mm,
perspective.
mm, mm.
I think that's also an important part of the lesson. I'm
Yeah.
not saying that all lessons to be effective have to repeat, but I think like in the Feldenkrais method, in our world in particular, there is this emphasis on novelty
Mm,
that leaves out the importance for repetition, for review. And review is important because it gives the student a sense of what they already understand. Again, a foundation. And it builds on that and it creates a kind of a feeling that that something is
mm,
familiar.
mm.
And then you can move on from that. I also think if we're thinking about the globality, the lesson as a whole, So what I'm watching as a teacher is this accumulation as I push from the foot to the lower leg, to the knee, to the hip, to their spine, and to their head eventually, or as I see the push follow that line, and that line become clearer. I think it's becoming clearer for the person.
Mm.
And that sensation of when I put my foot down, oh yeah, I'm standing, I'm on it. Because if I'm not on it, whoa. But once I'm on it, like knowing how to orient to that, it's almost like I think if the lights are out and you're trying to find like if the lights go out and you're trying to find a flashlight or your phone to be able to figure out what's going on in the room, it's that looking for a sensation, knowing what to orient to,
Mm.
knowing what the target is, that's really important. And I think what the lesson gives is the student the sensation of not like I'll be here forever, because of course, if I want to move, I have to leave that sense of stability and support.
Mm.
But being able to come to it, to know that it's there, I think that's what's the biggest change about that lesson.
Mm. And also one element I like very much about this lesson, and we talked the other day about the fact that actually we could use it in other lessons as well, is the fact that we come to, let's say, to contact the toe, and then we withdraw in a very um, kind of in a slow manner. We wait for the toe to follow,
Mhm.
and we just noticed that actually this is something that we often do in the I mean, in the artificial floor, but actually why not in every other lesson? Why not with the shoulder? Why not with, let's say, a hand or anything?
There is the like bringing the board to the toe, and like let's say you have contact with most of the toes and one of the
Yeah,
toes
yeah,
isn't touching, right? And bringing the contact there and waiting for that other toe to start
yeah,
looking,
yeah, yeah.
right? That's the hunting behavior you're talking about. And
Hmm.
then also there's the once you have contact, beginning to come away. And the thing is, there's the making and breaking of the contact,
Yeah,
right? So you can be on or off, but there's also this kind of barely making contact and making a little more contact. It's like I can I don't know, bring the pelvis and the ribs together and shorten the muscles in between and take over the effort of those muscles. And then I can remove my hands and come away. And that kind of supporting the work of the muscle is, effort substitution is what Johanan Weyrauch called it.
hmm
One of the first people that Moshe trained. I think that's a really wonderful thing. But what you're talking about is rather than coming all the way out or breaking contact all the way, just beginning to break it and stopping and waiting there,
mm
like for a beat, a breath, something, and then coming back again. That there is there's a in between the black and white of contact and no contact, or taking over all the work of the muscle and none of it. There's a range, and
mm
especially at the
hmm
beginning of bringing two places together, and then the beginning of coming away.
hmm
And now we're not talking about contact, but we're talking about the engaging of the work of the muscles. You're
hmm
talking to the muscles and uh, all the connective tissues there, and what's happening in the joints, because all of that is part of how the person is making sense. But in that very beginning and the person adjusting, especially the coming away, it, there's a rich world in that conversation between my movement and the person's sensation. and they're adjusting to and responding to what I did and me waiting for their response. There's an immense world in there, and that conversation in that small range has a really big impact on the overall.
Yeah. Mhm. There is something about the tonus, and I remember you saying something which felt really clear. I mean, as you said it, it's just like if someone has to stand and bring the weight to one foot or the other, like the tonus has to change. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
not has, but like let's say in
Well,
a
no,
normal
it does. It
situation,
does. Because when you're standing on one leg, that leg is tonified. The
yeah,
muscles of that leg are
yeah,
engaged.
yeah,
And the muscles of the other leg are, and not just the other leg, but the other side are not engaged because that leg has to, when you're walking, swing through.
yes,
Or when you're dancing, move through the air,
yes.
right?
So it felt also that in his case, there was an improvement on that side. I mean, on that with that, because when he was standing, his leg tend to. I mean, his let's say the leg that was kind of paralyzed tended to be maybe the tonus tended to be high all the time,
Right.
and paradoxically, he couldn't trust it. Or maybe not paradoxically, maybe he was trying to make it like more tense because he was hoping that it would stand and so on. And as we did the Feldenkrais, the artificial floor, there was something in Dawn that went down. And then when he stood up, he was able to release or get more engaged in the leg. So there was this distinction as well. What can you say about this
Well,
process,
but,
like in this lesson or
well, so
others?
first of all, if sorry, I cut you off there.
No, it's okay.
Um, I just get excited, you know. The I mean, you said it yourself, right? The tone wasn't changing.
Yeah.
And on one side it was really high. So that means that if it's really, you know, it's like being in a rock concert, you can't hear a conversation.
Mm,
So I think a lot of the sensations that we were talking about, him being able to notice, were below the threshold of what he can
mm,
notice because of that work. And because for whatever reason, it his, I mean, he, not consciously, but his, that then we have to say his nervous system, as if it's not him, the unconscious mechanisms. I don't know that I it's one per he is a unitary, he has a unitary experience in any moment in time, but it's made up of all of these um, components. Again, I don't think they're different parts because
mhm,
they can't exist in separate times,
mm,
right? I mean, they're all existing in the same moment. But it, if there's no change in the tone and he is unconsciously keeping it consistently that way, that's what his nervous system is busily engaged in.
mm,
So how can he make that shift that is necessary from side to side? And I think, you know, I don't mean this as an insult to him or anybody else in that situation, but it's like he has lost the capacity to make sense out of what's possible. The whole range of sensations, like those little modifications we were talking about a moment ago, they can't even exist. The beginning of the shifting of weight can't exist because he is so compulsively insisting on maintaining this, not consciously.
mm,
That he doesn't know in some real way that anything else is possible. And so in this lesson, um, you've removed that limitation, right? So the world is, you know, it's like in the Wizard of Oz when it goes from being black and white to being color, right? All of a sudden there's color. I mean, we experience that the first time you see that movie or that effect, it's not just a visual shift. It changes our sensation, our our the way we're being in some way. I think something similar happens there, and it shouldn't be underestimated, the significance of that. I mean,
Mhm.
if you experience it, it's significant, but from the outside, it's invisible.
So that's a very good conclusion, I see.
Okay.
I would say thank you very
Yeah.
much. And
We should continue because the
yes,
question of like,
definitely.
you know, you asked at the beginning a second question, which is what makes a lesson effective?
Mhm.
And I think, within that, there's what makes a lesson, as
Mhm.
opposed to an exercise or a choreography or whatever. Um, and I think both of those are really important in general, right? For ourselves as the functional integrator, right? Because if we don't have a sense of that, then it's like your student not having a sense of when he's standing. If we don't have a sense of that, then it can't guide us in a lesson. Even as some internal unconscious, am I on track or not? Right? Like, am I going the right way toward my friend's house or whatever? We have this internal fence which orients us. And again, it's not about cause and effect. It's about how where we're going is guiding where we are right now, where we aren't yet. And I think that is so important when we're giving lessons. There's the actual recipe, and then there's a sense of what delicious means,
Mhm.
how the flavors come together. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. So that's a teaser for our next conversation. If
Sure.
people want to know more,
All
actually,
right.
I do want
Cool.
to know more. So
All right.
see you next
Thanks.
time. Thank
Ciao.
you.